America, do you feel you've gotten a fair chance in life? What about your neighbor? In America today, 79% of voters believe that people should be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. More details right now on The Scott Rasmussen Show. Good morning. Welcome to The Scott Rasmussen Show. I'm Scott. Well, Edie's on vacation this week, so I'm joined today by my friend and co-host of Morning on Merritt Street, Fanchon Singer. Welcome.
Scott, thank you. I am so excited about being with you today. We usually have you on our show in the morning. I get to sit next to you in your home. So
That's
this
right.
is
Good to
wonderful.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. And good morning to you. Happy Sunday, America. It is great to be with you as well. You know, the race for the White House is heating up right now. Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump are focusing campaign energy on key battleground states. This race is still tight. And with less than 3 months until Election Day, the Trump, Vance, and Harris-Walz ticket, well, they are bringing a diverse array of backgrounds and experiences to this race. Taking a closer look, is this an indication of progress for our nation? And that's a really important question, Scott, because we're seeing so many unique aspects of both of these tickets that we really haven't seen before.
Right. Usually the talk is, are you team red or team blue? And nobody looks any further than that. But we actually have two small-town boys on the ticket running for vice president. One of them stayed in the small-town arena. The other went and served his country and went to Yale and became a venture capitalist, a whole different path. At the top of the ticket, we have two people who from cities, but we have a woman of mixed racial and ethnic background, and then a New York City boy in Donald Trump. And I just think that's an interesting mix.
It is a very interesting mix. You know, and J.D. Vance also brings, you know, his wife is of Indian descent as well, so there's more diversity there. And it's really interesting what is happening within the Republican Party. They're now being known and referred to as the Unity Party. We see more minorities switching to the Republican Party, more people of religious ethnic diversity as well. So it's really interesting to see that take shape. And then, of course, with the Harris-Walz campaign, you mentioned her being more of a big city, more of the elite, in that elite environment. I wonder what that's going to do in terms of how this race continues to play out.
Well, ultimately, it will come down to people's perceptions of the candidates and their competence in the issues. But for the moment, I think it's just great to celebrate that we've reached a point where you can have this kind of diversity on the ticket.
And I think, to answer the question, it is a sign of progress, both in our nation and in the political landscape.
Great.
Very exciting to see that. All right, stay with us because we have a packed show today with new polling information and insight into the key issues to help you decide who is best prepared to lead our nation for the next 4 years. Some of these numbers, they are going to surprise you today. Plus, a workplace issue getting a lot of attention. It's not productivity or safety or even salaries, but rather how people identify their gender. And remember, unless we say otherwise, all of the polls cited on the show are conducted by Scott's firm, RMG Research. Right now, let's hear Scott's thoughts this week. So, Scott, what's on your mind?
In the 18th century, our nation was founded upon the noble ideals of freedom, equality, and self-governance. Americans claiming that heritage often recall Thomas Jefferson's eloquent words in the Declaration of Independence. We were all created equal. We were endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln spoke of our nation as being conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The Civil War, as he saw it, was a test to determine whether any nation committed to those ideals could actually survive. Lincoln called for a new birth of freedom. He said it was needed so that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. In the 20th century, the best description for the hope of America was given by a Baptist preacher 61 years ago this past week. In the midst of racial injustice and violence, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did not reject America's founding ideals. Instead, he challenged our nation to live up to those ideals. In King's magnificent dream, his 4 little children would grow up to live in a nation where they would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. When we allow freedom to ring, King declared, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black and white, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, or all of them will be able to sing, in King's words, the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Well, the challenge for America today is the same as it was when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, the same as it was when Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. It was in 1963 when King spoke at the March on Washington. To honor those who came before us, we must once again challenge our nation to live up to its noble founding ideals. And to be honest, that means confronting some uncomfortable truths. It's important to remember that Dr. King's message was more than just dreaming of a land where the color of your skin didn't matter. He knew that America was a land of opportunity. At the same time, he also knew that there were too many Americans, both black and white, who had no opportunity, no hope. 6 decades ago, he called upon our nation to eradicate the poverty in our midst. And that remains a challenge for us today. Sadly, too many Americans forget that part of King's message. They celebrate his call for a colorblind society, but ignore his challenge to make sure that everyone in every corner of our society has the chance to succeed. That commitment, that drive to ensure that pursuit of happiness is realistically available to everyone is an essential part of our national heritage. Those are my thoughts.
Scott, those were powerful, powerful thoughts, and I love that you bring the entire message of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King full circle.
He was an amazing leader, and too often people just think, oh, he's the guy with the dream, or he had that one moment. It was so much more than that. He stood for so much more than that, and his leadership is a great role model for all Americans. And by the way, he's very popular today. Nearly 9 out of 10 Americans say they have a favorable opinion of his. But he was not popular at the time.
No, there was a lot of struggle.
A lot of struggle.
And there was a lot to overcome. My grandfather's farm, my grandparents lived in Natchez, Mississippi, and their farm was the headquarters for the southern region, and all of the civil rights leaders would always meet at my grandparents' farm, strategize, plan the marches, plan what was going to be happening. And my grandfather actually started the very first chapter for the NAACP in Mississippi, right there where my grandparents lived. And it's interesting because if you think about the conversation surrounding race and surrounding diversity right now, a lot of people have forgotten Dr. Martin Luther King was fighting so that you, so that me, so that every young person would be judged by the content of their character. So often now we have this juxtaposition between equality and equity. And most Americans don't realize equality and equity are not the same thing.
No, in fact, Fanchon, we actually asked a polling question about this. If you had a choice for a candidate to vote for, one who said we should all be treated equally, and the other one who said equality is not enough, we need equity, we need to end up at the same place. 72% of Americans said, I would vote for the candidate who called for equality. Just 16% favored equity. So Dr. King's ideas still resonate with Americans today.
And that is very encouraging because when you look at what equity is, equity really has the underpinnings of socialism and communism because that is a manufactured outcome and it's based on race. In this country, a lot of young people are being taught, well, there's something called white privilege. Well, if that's true, then I wouldn't be sitting here right next to you today.
Now, I'm glad you are.
I am glad I am too. Thank you. But there is a privilege.
Right.
The privilege is what you stated. It's economic privilege. We need to make sure that all people have access to economic privilege because if not for economic privilege, just like Dr. King said, we want low-income minorities, everyone to be able to be equal and bring something to the table, but something of merit. You work hard for it and you earn your right to be there.
Absolutely.
Let's dive in right now and let's turn to the election and updating voter sentiment when it comes to trusting the candidates on some of the key issues. So, Scott, I'm excited to see what the numbers are this week.
Well, the numbers, you'll start with the fact, what are the issues? What are the most important topics?
Yes.
And On the show, we talk a lot about how the economy and immigration are the two biggest issues facing the nation right now. Today, we want to take a look at some of the other topics because the economy sets the baseline, but in a close election, every issue could make a difference.
Absolutely. You start off with crime here.
Right? Can't ignore it.
Yeah. 57% of voters say it's very important.
Very important issue. Other than the economy and immigration, this tops the list. What happens when we start to ask, who do you trust on this issue? Well, it's pretty much a toss-up. 46% say they trust former President Trump. 43% say they trust Vice President Harris on this topic.
It's really interesting because we talk about these numbers so often being so partisan.
Oh, absolutely.
But then you have the conversation right now on Kamala Harris, and a lot of people don't know the details on where she stands. For instance, her support defunding the police. There was recently a survey removed from her website that focused on disarming, disarming traffic patrolmen and women, which could be a huge problem and affect crime, the fight on crime.
It certainly could, and this is an issue that in some parts of the country is more important than others. What political people tend to forget is only 8% of voters talk politics every day. So if this is going to be an issue that the Trump campaign wants to focus on, well, they need to make it an issue. There will only be one or two key points that stick in the minds of most voters. Now, another big issue.
Very highly partisan issue as well.
Right, especially since the Dobbs decision. Just over half of all voters say abortion is very important, and there's no real surprise here in terms of who voters trust. Harris is trusted by 49% of voters. That's 13% more than former President Trump. Look, we're going to hear a lot about this between now and Election Day.
And you mentioned the importance of President Trump talking about this issue, simply bringing it to the forefront. And he always likes to tout that he returned the power to the states, which he always says it was originally intended for, whereas we know on the Democratic side, that is a really, really big issue for them.
Now, Fanchon, one of the things when you talk about when you mention talking about this issue, that is so important. You know, if you ask a candidate their position and they have a response and it's thoughtful, well, that's better than trying to dodge it. Most Republicans, too many Republicans, I should say, just want to bury their head in the sand and pretend this issue will go away. And by the way, most important thing to remember on this issue, if you're talking about it, there are two lives involved. That's why it's a difficult issue. And if you're talking about the unborn child, you also need to be concerned about the woman who's involved, often a woman in difficult circumstances.
Yeah. And oftentimes there's a man involved too that doesn't get talked about either.
That's true. And by the way, the single most popular reform position on the abortion issue, 8 out of 10 people say that if a man gets a woman pregnant, he should be responsible for caring for her and the child, not only during the pregnancy, but after the pregnancy.
Very interesting.
So now we'll move on to education.
Education, yes. Look, very important to 49% of the polls.
This is an interesting issue because it's primarily a state and local issue. It gets talked about in national campaigns. If you ask, should we shift more power from the Department of Education to local school boards, people say yes. But people care about their kids. Always, always a big issue. And on this one, once again, this is historic. Democrats have the advantage, typically have the advantage on education. Sometimes Republicans narrow the gap. But right now, Vice President Harris has an 11-point edge on this topic. Gun laws.
Oh, boy.
Yeah,
that's another hot issue.
Hard to picture something that's more controversial. Half the nation considers it very important. And perhaps surprising to some, people are split between the two parties. A lot of people on both sides of this issue say, hey, you know what? Everybody agrees with me. Simply not true.
Yeah.
People think you should have the right to own a gun, but they also want to address safety concerns.
Let's switch gears to what's been a very controversial issue. We're talking about illegal immigration. Scott, tell us what your new polling data shows us about voting requirements and how voters are actually feeling about this.
Well, it's important to recognize that voters overwhelmingly say legal immigration is good for America, but 84% say illegal immigration is bad. As for this election coming up, well, 54% of voters, just over half, say it's likely that a large number of illegal immigrants will actually be allowed to vote. That's a big concern. 3 out of 4 voters say that shouldn't be allowed to happen. So there is this sense that something is wrong with the process. There's the whole discussion about should you be required to show proof of citizenship before you're allowed to register to vote. Voters overwhelmingly think that should be done. There's also some other issues. You know, if you have a driver's license in a lot of states, you can register to vote. Most voters think not only should you be allowed to be required to show photo ID before you cast your ballot, they also think if you are not a citizen and you're in one of those states that gives illegal immigrants a driver's license, it should be clearly indicated on your license that you are not a citizen. And I want to be very clear about this. This is concern about the integrity of the voting process. This is making sure that citizens are the ones who vote. There's not a deeper conspiracy behind this, Leroy.
All right, Scott, that's great. Today, Scott, a recent New York Post article related to campaign and election integrity caught my eye about the Harris campaign offering job applicants 9 different options when it comes to gender identity. Now, I have to be honest, I did not know, I don't think that most people watching or most people in America know that there are even 9 options.
Well, most voters tell us there's only 2.
Yeah.
You're either male or female.
Yeah.
Now, there has been a lot of discussion about this topic, and it goes in different directions. Some of the ways we hear about it have to deal with what pronouns should you use. Most Americans aren't even familiar with them, as you suggest.
No, I took an opportunity to look at that list of the different pronouns. I've not heard of almost half of them.
Right. Well, and 27%, by the way, just 27% think that if a biological male decides that he should identify as a woman, only 27% think it's appropriate to say her. And in fairness, people are just uncomfortable with the topic. They're not sure how you would deal with someone. And realistically, you deal with them as a human. You deal with them on a personal basis. But we get caught up in some of these labels.
Yeah, you have a lot of numbers that relate to this, and it seems that most Americans, their views on this are quite different than what you might hear or what that 1% of the elite that you always talk about, what they are projecting to all of us.
And for the most part, it's pretty common sense. Voters overwhelmingly believe that biological males should not be allowed to compete in women's sports. They don't think biological males should be allowed, in the girls' room or the girls' locker room. There is a sense that this is something that's both an issue of fairness and also one of safety for young women. It's an issue we're going to be dealing with for a long time. And like all the other fraught issues, it's going to take a little bit before society sorts it out. But I can tell you one thing, it will not be resolved by government action.
No.
It will be resolved by individuals working through other people, through their friends and neighbors and community.
Well, Scott, no matter what the conversation is or where it goes, you always bring us right back to the data. And we so appreciate that.
It's my job.
That's right, and you do a great job at it. Okay, we are just about out of time today, and with all of the new numbers you saw, you don't have to worry about remembering them. To help you keep track, you can now go online to napolitannews.org. That's napolitannews.org, and there you will see all of the polling data that we discuss. All right, Scott, so what's the number not to forget this week?
The one number not to forget is that in America today, 79% of voters believe that people should not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That's it for this week on The Scott Rasmussen Show. Stay connected with us all week for Fanchon Stinger and the entire Merritt Street team that helped put this program together. I'm Scott Rasmussen. America, have a great week.